Hello and welcome to this edition of New Humanum. My guest today is Tim Stanley. Tim is a columnist with the Daily Telegraph, a well-known writer, has published many books, historian by training, and also someone who did a PhD, Cambridge educated, and also a man of faith. And Tim, I wanted to start by asking you about something you wrote recently, a column which struck me because you were quite explicitly offering Christianity as the antidote to woke. That you said that you were talking about new atheists and the new atheism which had permeated society and which had led, in your view, to a lot of the problems we now endure. Do you often write from the perspective of faith? Do you always write from the perspective of faith? Does faith actually infuse what you write and your worldview always?
I often find that I don't intend to write from the point of view of faith, but on so many issues, such as woke, I come back to faith as an explanation or an answer. And so I find that it sometimes surprises me that it will creep in and it will emerge. So in that instance, to give that example, I was considering where does woke come from, and I noticed that a lot of people who were once new atheists, most prominently Richard Dawkins, had become very critical of woke and had found themselves in a woke war. But they also had discovered that many former new atheists themselves had become woke. So new atheism was supposed to be about total rationality, the rejection of a God-ordered universe, that it's all about science. And yet a lot of the people who signed up to that 20 years ago had themselves gone on to become woke. Why was this? Well, if you approach the issue from a faith perspective, you'd say, well, the thing about atheism is it removes the point to life. It can do. I mean, I know people have other... People fill that vacuum with things like families and jobs and culture and philosophy. But it can, for many people, remove the point to life. And once you stop looking up for your solutions and outward for your answers, you start looking inward instead. And I just think there's some irony in the people who did their best to destroy the old order of the way we thought about things find themselves now living with the consequences of it. And that extends to things like science and biology. And how ironic that Dawkins should late in the day discover that he has a lot in common with Christians in the sense that we take biology seriously too. We think male and female is a real thing too, that it's a chromosomal thing, and that nature can give us some sense of how our life is intended to be led, that we are intended to, in principle, reproduce, etc. So that's an example of how I would start out from a question, why is this thing happening? Why is woke happening? Interrogate it, and I find the answers so often come back to religion. And on occasion, I am myself, and my readers are probably a little frustrated. Some people accuse me of crowbarring God in. But if you accept the existence of God, it shapes how you think about literally everything. So it's hardly a surprise that you can't resist the temptation to return to him as an answer, because it's the nature of theology and it's the nature of belief that you do think God has an answer and in fact is the answer to every question.
See, I thought it was a very insightful piece, that. I wonder though whether Dawkins, for instance, reflects on this and reflects on the way in which a belief in God, the Christian teaching about creation, the reality of God and the reality of creation, the reality of male and female. These are, in our view, God ordained, are they not? From Dawkins' point of view, you wonder whether the question arises in his mind either.
See, I think the frustrating thing is the kind of scientist he is. Because he's a geneticist, he has followed science along a particular path that perhaps has cut off the avenues that might lead to God, whereas, of course, so much of physics accords and fits with a spiritual view of the universe. And I think we're going to find, and we are finding it already, how often the more our science advances, the more we understand the world, the more questions it actually raises, the more metaphysical science becomes, and the more it leaves open a path back to God. So if you take the debate over male and female, for instance, there is a group of people now who are saying male and female is a cultural thing. It's a matter of perspective. There's a distinction between sex and gender. It can change. We don't really know what causes it. Maybe it's the product of environment, etc., etc. And that's the point at which scientists, now having this sophisticated understanding of chromosomes and how they work, say, no, male and female are something which are implanted in us and are implanted from thousands of years ago and have been passed down through evolution and are stamped on every single chromosome. Now, my point is that if you listen to that scientific explanation of male and female, this notion of origin, the idea that it's written into us as a code, and the idea that from that nature we can divine some sense of purpose to our lives, or some sense of order, because you're a female, you are intended, in principle, not everyone does, but you're intended in principle to carry children. You are a male, you are intended in principle to inseminate, etc., etc. All of that could be read as a metaphor for Christianity and its view of creation. That there is a moment at which God creates man and woman, that he designs them for a purpose, and our understanding of self is drawn from that purpose. Now, we're not a prisoner of that identity. Of course we're not. And there are people who, for instance, are born intersex. There are people who have sexual and romantic relationships with people of the same gender. There are people who are born infertile. There are people who choose, like me, not to have kids. I'm not saying we're a prisoner of that identity. But science keeps coming back to this sense that there is an order in the universe. And that to me seems like it seems to affirm the religious view of life.
How did you arrive at this, your worldview as it now is? You were raised, I think, as I understand it, in a Baptist household. Were you always a religious boy? Did you carry religion through your childhood, adolescent years into manhood? What was your own personal history?
I was fortunate, and I fear I might be the last, to be part of a generation that grew up taking religion for granted and regarding it as part of life, like music or good food. My family, I wasn't born into a Baptist household. My parents didn't go to church at all. They became Baptists. I can't remember when. But they became Baptists at some point and started taking me to a Baptist church. Which I hated. And like a lot of kids, I kicked against and I rejected my parents' beliefs. I think my father didn't really believe in it at all either. He saw it as a social thing and he liked the people. My mother did and does believe in it. Although one thing you learnt was that even if you didn't believe in it, and something that stayed with me, is those people were incredibly nice. They were some of the kindest people. And it's rare in life to meet people who will do something nice for the sake of doing something nice, and will not actually expect anything in return. I always darkly say whenever I encounter a Christian, there's a dark part of me that thinks, this is great, I can exploit this person as much as I like because they're obliged to let me. But I, of course, have to play that role as well. That sounds terribly cynical, but I know that if someone I don't particularly like wants a lift somewhere, I've got to give it to them, even if I don't particularly want to. I can't just cook up an excuse because I'm obliged to do it. So that notion of being obliged to be a good person, that stayed with me, even if I rejected the theology. But in that household, even before they were Baptists, they believed in something, and they talked about religion. They were very educated, although they didn't actually stay at school, but they were sort of self-educated, autodidact. They knew a lot about the world, and religion was part of the language of the household. There was a sort of an assumption that there was something beyond ourselves. And as I say, I rejected it when I was a teenager, but then when I went to university, I don't know why, I started to randomly attend churches looking for a church. I went on a sort of a journey. I started high. I had this sense that I wanted something very different from the Baptists, that I wanted a church that was sacramental, that was full of incense and colour and music. And through that, I began a slow journey towards the Catholics through the Anglicans and the Anglo-Catholics. But I'm always reluctant to present this as a clear narrative. John Bradburn, the mystic and missionary, and I'm not sure if he's been officially made a saint yet or not, but he has a lovely way of describing it. He said, religion isn't taught, it's caught. And I would say I caught it like a fever. And it has stayed with me. And over time, it has grown into something mature. When I first got into it, I didn't really understand it at all. But I was really drawn by a sense of something, not by an intellectual argument.
I mean, I think the rejection of your parents' religion in adolescence is a very, very common phenomenon.
Oh, yes, yes.
But I think also because, I mean, certainly I went through that myself, and so many Christians do. But as you say, if you start thinking about the world and looking for explanations of the world, you come to a point where you have to judge between what is on offer.
Yes.
And Christianity, to me, at a certain point when I was in my 20s, I thought, well, actually this makes sense from whichever way you look at it. If everybody in the world was a good Christian, the world would be a better place.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think that's true. Of course, they might also be at war with each other, having sectarian conflict. So I don't want to come across this all sounds terribly arrogant and smug. But what you said there is interesting about looking at the different choices. Of course, to be able to judge in the supermarket of ideas, which is the right idea, you've got to be able to read the packet. And as I said, I am so privileged to have been part of the generation that was raised with some exposure to religion at school and with my parents, such that religious language and ideas are not a mystery to me. I compare it to being taught an instrument at a young age. Every kid's taught the recorder or the violin, and they all hate it and they all give it up. But the point is that in their 30s or 40s they can read music. So if they want to take it up again, they'll be able to do so. What worries me about the current generation, and I've noticed it with some of the colleagues and people I've known under about 30 or 25, is they have no religious sense at all. They're still drawn to it because they see people doing this strange thing that seems to bring benefit to their life and seems to make sense of the world to them. So the religion still retains this mysterious, flickering attraction to them, but they haven't been taught the language. And I'm one of the last generation that was, so that when I decided I did want to do it, it wasn't strange or alien to me. It wasn't odd to walk into a church and just try it. It wasn't peculiar to read a book on Buddhism and try and find out what it is they believe. So even if I did reject my parents' church, they implanted in me an understanding of faith that meant I could return to it later on.
There's a huge amount of religious illiteracy, isn't there? I think in journalism particularly. I mean, working in the BBC as I did, I think there was a lot of just sheer ignorance about religion and the part it plays in people's lives, the importance of actually understanding, very often actually understanding international situations. You need to be able to understand what is driving a situation, and the history of religious conflict you often find in the world.
Whenever I get a call from a media organisation to say we want to talk about religion, there's a part of me that always thinks, you want to discuss sex, don't you? That's religion in the modern media landscape. Yeah. It's sex. It's homosexuality, it's abortion, sex outside marriage, divorce. They think Christians are just obsessed with sex, and that at church we go to it and we just have a big conversation every week about what not to do in bed. It's bizarre. Now, actually, when I was getting into religion when I was young, I probably did think about sex a lot, because young people do, and I did think about the sexual morality of Christianity. I did dwell upon that subject, but now, I'm afraid to say into my 40s, do you know I never think about it at all? And the only time I think about Christian morality and sex is when someone rings me up and says, can you please come on and talk about religion from a Catholic point of view? And I think, oh, it's condom week.
Now, you were also quite politically active at one point. How did religious sensibility play into your politics? You were on the left initially.
Yes. Again, I'm very nervous about drawing narratives. And of course, as a historian, you order events and facts and dates to tell a narrative and a clear story. But there is something in the fact that I ran for Parliament for my hometown of Sevenoaks as a Labour candidate the same year I converted to Catholicism. There's something in that fact. And it was as if the two things of politics and theology reached a meeting point and then gradually divided. So they reached a meeting point because, of course, in Catholicism there is a great tradition of social gospel, social activism, verum novarum, and emphasizing those aspects of Catholicism which border on socialistic. But equally, there are aspects of Catholicism which conflict with the modern left. We're back to sex, but it's true. There are perspectives about sex and sexuality which are different from that of the left, particularly abortion. But also, faith is not about social activism. That's an aspect of it because you want to improve the world and help your fellow man. But faith is also private, internal. It's about the transcendent. And it draws you away from 20th century left and right politics, back into, well, medieval scholasticism, all the way back into the classics and Aristotle and Plato. If you read into it and take it very seriously, you're just pulled intellectually away from the 20th century. We've lived in an unusual period in time. It's the nature of thinking about history. It's the nature of man always to think that his time is eternal, that all time is like this. No, we've lived through an industrial revolution that produced a very specific politics of left and right, with a very particular view of the state and the individual and their relationship to other people. As soon as you get into religion, you have a 2,000 or 4,000 year view. Your ethics are shaped by the Old Testament mixed in with some Greek philosophy. And so politics, it's not just that you begin to disagree with your comrades in the Labour Party, it's that much of politics starts to look staggeringly irrelevant to you. Because I'm interested less and less in policy. I'm interested less and less in how the government can fix things, and more in how I can order myself to be a better and healthier and happier person, and as part of that, how I can help other people. It's my personal responsibility. When I was young, I would have thought that bringing about the socialist revolution, which establishes Tim Stanley as the chairman of the British Labour Party and thus dictator, I would have thought that Orwellian vision was what was going to save mankind. I now think giving an old lady a lift to church is far more important. I can actually do some good. That's where the locus of your attention shifts from the social to the personal and the political. So it's not just that I rejected the politics. I rejected politics in general.
To what extent do you think these days that religion plays a part in the debates, in the sense of how many people do you think there are in the parties generally who are motivated by religion?
A lot. And I would say that proportionately, the House of Commons is far more religious than the rest of the country. The reason why you might not notice that is because, and it's not just in politics, but in general, Christianity has been privatized. That might be, or personalized is possibly a better word. Because we have imported the American idea that there's a separation of church and state, which there isn't in this country because we have a state church and the king is the head of it. But we've imported that idea, and because also Christianity has lost its cultural purchase and we're all a bit embarrassed about it, we keep it private. So a lot of MPs go to church. There are a lot of Muslims, Hindus. Our Prime Minister is, from what I can work out, quite a devout Hindu. To my frustration, he never talks about it. I wish he would. I think it's fascinating that he's a Hindu. I want to know what he believes, what school of Hinduism he's attached to. Does he regard himself as monotheistic, like Vivek Ramaswamy in America? I would love to know these things, but we have developed this ahistorical idea that in Britain we don't talk about religion. We just do it privately, like it's going to the lavatory or something. It's at that level of personal hygiene. It's just not something I discuss. Religion does come up from time to time in the Commons because there will be an expressly religious question. So there was a debate recently about gay marriage and the Church of England. And a number of MPs stood up who said, I am Anglican and I take this view. Overwhelmingly, they were on the pro-gay marriage side. And I thought that was very telling, that I suspect that when gay marriage was debated about a decade ago, there was still a small but significant number of MPs who would explicitly have said, I'm against this for religious reasons. But when that was debated, either because people feel they don't want to intrude into the Church of England's personal politics, I don't know what it was, but almost no one spoke up from a biblical or conservative Christian point of view, or an Orthodox Jewish or a Muslim point of view. So the emphasis was very much upon the liberal Christian point of view. But then that might represent trends in middle-class Christianity. In this country, Anglicanism and even evangelical Anglicanism has become very liberal.
Do you think those people are simply intimidated by the threat of, a social media pylon, the sort of odium that, I mean, were you to stand up in the House of Commons and say you were against gay marriage in the way that you describe? By the way, I find it fascinating that you say that religion plays a bigger part in the private lives of those MPs than we would know, because it's certainly not an impression that I've gathered recently from Parliament, but you know it,
I've been surprised by this. I go to sort of parliamentary religious events and things like that, and there are a lot of them there. And it's really striking at election time how many of them will emphasise that they're a member of a church or they're engaged in some kind of church activity. And there are people who really surprise you, hard left people who you'd think weren't, who will say, well, actually, I am a Catholic and things like that. So, and there's a thriving religious scene behind closed doors in the Commons. There's a lot of religion in Parliament. But just on that point, I think if one reason why the more conservative religious people won't speak out is because why would they want to have the fight when it not only creates such trouble for them, but coverage of it is so biased? So to give an example, recently Danny Kruger spoke in Parliament about abortion. Danny I think he's an evangelical Christian. And he said that nobody technically has complete autonomy over their bodies, and nobody should. Which I would have thought is not even necessarily a religious argument. It can be a humanist, secular, ethical position, which I think is actually a statement of fact. In this country, for instance, we discourage people from committing suicide. We don't allow people to commit, we don't have euthanasia and things like that. So I think it's just an accurate statement. Well, people turned up in his constituency. People said he was appalling, he had the Twitter pile-on, but also the media coverage, I don't think fairly went into what he was saying and why and what he really meant by it. And I admire Danny enormously for refusing to back down, but there are many more conservative MPs who will have watched that and thought, I just don't want to have that happen to me. Because I'm not in Parliament. I can't change abortion policy in Parliament. It's a personal vote. If it ever comes up, it rarely comes up. The tide of legislation is towards making it more liberal, not the other way. So I'm never going to contribute towards restricting abortion. So there's no point me bringing it up. And if I do bring it up, then the other things I care about are going to be completely eclipsed by me having talked about that issue. So I can sympathise with and understand why more conservative religious people choose not to talk about certain subjects.
Well, look what happened to Tim Farron, for instance.
Yes, exactly. Oh, no, he is the canary in the coal mine. He's what everyone talks about when they think about the role of religion. Yes. And again, we're back to sex. How many interesting questions to ask an evangelical Christian about their theology? How many? I don't know what his theology is. Is he Calvinistic? Does he believe? Does he believe in total depravity of man? There are so many fascinating questions to ask. What do they go for? What do you think about gay sex?
Where do you think this reticence about discussing religion and personal faith in particular in public life comes from? I mean, it's quite different. You know, in America, it's common to see. In fact, it's almost obligatory for politicians on the stump to profess and broadcast their religious beliefs and their fervour. Here it's quite the opposite. Where do you think that comes from?
I think, first of all, the American politicians are probably behind the times. The things are trending in a secular way in America, and you could probably get away with not bringing it up. But I think that for some politicians it's a shorthand way of displaying a philosophy. So in the case of Biden, it brings a degree of colour and philosophy and something extra to his political personality that he might not otherwise have, because he can't just defend straightforward liberalism or social democracy. But in this country, there is a touch of British reserve. There is some anxiety around multiculturalism. Am I going to offend people? But I think also somehow we've just bought into the myth that for a long time, perhaps since the Reformation, we've just not done religion. The country that is the home of Quakers, the country that's the home of Methodists, the country that gave us Gladstone, and particularly the idea that we don't mix politics and religion is just utter nonsense. So I think, I don't know how we've persuaded ourselves that this is the case, but it's something I find very frustrating about Britain, and is one reason why I was drawn to and have spent a lot of time in America. I can have a conversation about religion over there that I can't have here.
I mean, and it is quite a recent phenomenon, because if you think back to the 19th century, the Oxford movement, for instance, was hugely controversial and very political, and you know, it created fierce debate. You couldn't imagine such a thing happening now.
Yes, but it also is about choices made by individual churches. And if you take my church, the Roman Catholics, because sometimes people can be overly critical of the Anglicans, well, there was a strong sense within the Roman Catholics that having finally been emancipated, having finally been invited into British society as a fully fledged citizen, you don't want to blow it. You want to fit in as far as possible. You don't want to offend people. You don't want to stand out. And that it's actually a triumph of Catholicism. It's a success story that it's non-controversial. And I think that has been at the expense of some of its prophetic power.
Basil Hume, I think, was the exemplar of that.
Yes.
I mean, he was very much the establishment man. And I think there is an attraction to English Catholics of quietude, the idea of being quiescent,
yes,
of staying below the radar, and as you say, rejoicing in the fact that we are actually allowed to practice the faith as we see fit.
Yes. Well, as we're discussing media, a friend of mine, and I'm going to be vague about all the terms and give no names because I don't want to give anyone away, but a friend of mine was making a show that dealt with a classic ethical question that would appeal to the Catholic Church and upon which Pope Francis had spoken. And he immediately approached the press offices and various bishops and things and said, can you please put someone on the show to discuss it? He could find no one. And all it meant was defending what the Pope had said. They weren't being invited to say anything that was of controversy within the Church or that the public probably wouldn't broadly agree with. They didn't want to talk about it.
Well, that sounds like cowardice.
I don't know what it is. I think it could also be malaise and administrative dysfunction and a misunderstanding about what appeals about religion to people.
True to form, you're being very charitable in your explanation.
Yes.
So, why Catholicism? I mean, you had the tasting menu.
Yes.
And you sampled what was out there, and then you eventually decided, why Rome?
Well, let's put it this way, that if you get over first the stumbling block of whether or not God exists, you want to try to work out, what should I do about it? How should that shape my life? So if you accept Christianity, then what form of Christianity? You then go on a great mission to find out what for you is the right brand, but also what you conclude is the most authentic. And for me, it's the Church's claim to be the first church created with Peter as its rock. That is what immediately gives it a prominence and a claim that I think you have to interrogate honestly. And I understand why people reach other conclusions, but to me, that intellectually makes sense. It also was just a fit. It was something where I went to it and I thought, this is home. I feel perfectly comfortable here. And again, because we've been through a Reformation, the British have persuaded themselves that they are innately Anglican or innately Protestant. But the Catholic Church was around for a very long time before that. It has survived because it understands human nature and it speaks to it. And there's something about the Catholic worldview, not just its theology, but its perspective, which is brilliantly expressed in literature, people like Evelyn Waugh or G.K. Chesterton. There's something about its worldview that makes sense to me. An example of that is confession, the desire to confess. Again, completely misunderstood by the modern world. You don't just, again, go in there and talk about sex for an hour while the priest gets off on it. It's ridiculous. It's about an honest interrogation about how you're living your life and the absolute blessing of knowing, of hearing, of having it confirmed to you that God loves you and will forgive you for that, and that you are released from it. That there's something in that I spoke to me on a very human level. That was something I needed.
Apropos of confession, I was once interviewing a senior policeman in the south of Ireland, in Dublin, and he said, my job in the old days was so easy. He said, because everybody in the country was so used to confessing. As soon as you hoiked them into the police station, they coughed up everything they had.
Yes, yeah.
Let me ask you finally, so you have a perspective as a historian, and you said a few minutes ago about the way you saw this drift towards secularism, the way that the pull of secularism seems to be very strong at the moment, and society, not only our society, but others in the West are going that way. Do you think that tide could be reversed, should be reversed? Do you think it will be reversed? Are you optimistic about the future? As a Catholic, as a person of faith, are you optimistic about the future?
Yeah, well, one, you have to be, you're obliged to be, because Christianity is all about hope, and despair is, to despair is a sin. You can't do that. You have to have faith, because we are taught that things will be all right in the end. But also, the more reading you do, the more you realize that this is not unusual, what we're going through. That societies go through periods like this. We went through one in the 19th century in which people were saying things that are strikingly similar to what we're saying today. And then things changed. They just changed. So in the 19th century, you had the challenges of technological change, Marx, and crucially Darwin. And for a lot of people, Darwin was it. It was game over from then on, once we discovered we're all descended from monkeys. But then you come around to the 1930s, 40s and 50s, and you see a huge growth in interest in religion, and you see things going back the other way. So it would be un-Christian to despair, but it would also be ahistorical to imagine that human populations are either static, they stay one way forever in their ideas, or that they don't reverse. History shows us that that's not the case. I'm always
a recent book which had a big impact on me and many others, was Tom Holland's book Dominion.
Oh yes, yes.
And the way in which he brought into focus, didn't he, the way in which this society is Christian through formation.
Yes.
Yes. That so much of actual that modern liberalism, when you examine its tenets, many of which are merciful, compassionate, are reaching out to people who have been marginalised, and so we can all applaud that.
Yes.
But actually, the wellspring of those ideas comes not from socialism, not from Marxism, but actually from Christianity and from its very roots.
Oh yes, and I thought that about many movements we were discussing, woke, many quote-unquote woke movements, where I listen to what they want and what they think, and I think, oh, you're a Christian sect. You're just one of the many branches off of mainstream Christianity that we've had throughout the years. It's just that you don't have Jesus Christ. But in terms of your ethics, your worldview, your concern for the end of the world, your concern for personal transformation, your concern for the marginalized whose societies turn their back on, which is very often very well intended, you are fundamentally expressing a Christian point of view. And it might surprise those people to discover that in other societies, they're focused particularly upon the needs of the individual, particularly on the needs of marginalized individuals. They might be surprised to find that that doesn't exist innately in other societies, that possibly is a cultural product.
One final question. When you look around the media landscape, which you inhabit at the Daily Telegraph actually, it's always struck me that the Telegraph, this is as a reader of the Telegraph for decades, it always has struck me that the Telegraph has more sympathy with the Catholic viewpoint than many other outlets. Do you think that's true?
No comment. I think that is not by design or by constitution. I think that is a reflection of changes in the Anglican Church and the position in which the Catholic Church finds itself. I think the bigger question is, why does so many conservatives become Catholic? Why, for instance, in the United States, is the Supreme Court dominated by Catholics? That's a very interesting question.
What's your answer?
Well, I think the answer is partly because Protestantism has become so liberal and has associated itself so firmly with the left, and it's because the Catholic Church, although it has changed, and it looks very different to what it looked like 100 years ago, it's not appreciated, but it has altered. But because the Catholic Church does tradition and it does doctrine, and it believes that doctrine can develop, teachings can develop, but they don't change, the Catholic Church has made itself a rock upon which many people who are loyal to the values of Western civilization can build a home. And I think that's why you're right. It's so often, if you want to talk about a religious issue and you want a conservative / orthodox / old-fashioned point of view, it's just much easier to speak to a Catholic and get that answer. But that's also true on a whole list of ethical and philosophical questions. Catholics have an answer to them, and that answer tends to fit more with a conservative worldview. And that is why so many conservative publications end up employing so many Catholics.
Tim Stanley, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I know you have to rush away to be over in the House of Commons now, so thank you very much for being on New Humanum.
Thank you for having me.